think we've moved on from the narrative of talent development being just a simple eye test or, a one-off competition performance to say, yes, that's the new future Olympic champion. Unfortunately, we need to begin to adopt more prospective, longitudinal methodologies where we look at the progression of the athlete over an extended period of time rather than, very small specific windows.
So welcome, Dior, to Evidence Strong Show. I'm thrilled to have you. And if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Great to be here, Alex. Thanks for inviting us on. So quite right, I'm Dior Anderson. So I completed my PhD back in 2020 at Bangor University, in which I conducted a series of investigations to understand the development of elite performance and performance development in weightlifting athletes using machine learning, which I guess helps to consider a range of factors in profiling high performance together in one research project. And so very excited to delve into those findings and any further information you might want to know.
Awesome. So I had Vicky come on and discuss the first part of this big project you mentioned, looking at retrospective data. So asking athletes kind of to go back and think through some things that could have been related to their success or lack thereof in terms of weightlifting performance. And today we'll be talking about the study titled Capturing the Holistic Profile of High Performance Olympic Weightlifting Development. And this study was prospective. So could you tell us what it means and why you decided to run this study the way you did?
Yes, of course. So most research to date, certainly up until the date of our publication, typically adopted a retrospective inquiry approach. And so by using this prospective approach, we can, first of all, of course, progress the literature, because retrospective inquiries tend to have limitations such as recall bias. Athletes who tend to recall memories early in their formative years perhaps tend to be biased by events that happened later on. And so by deploying a prospective research design, this enabled us to monitor those factors that the literature determines as being important for high performance longitudinally. And so we can gauge a real snapshot in terms of how these factors develop and contribute to the success of some of these, in this case, Olympic weightlifting athletes. And so it's again that step on. This was the third chapter from memory in my PhD thesis. So it was a follow-up study to the study that you would have discussed with Vicky.
Excellent. So who were the participants and how did you go about recruiting them and what did you ask them to do?
Yeah, so we completed the project as a whole in collaboration with the national governing body for weightlifting in Wales, Weightlifting Wales. And so we worked very closely with their performance directors and pathway managers to essentially gain access to many of the youth and junior lifters that were currently on their pathway at the time. We used predominantly, as mentioned, youth and junior lifters, which ranged from an age range between 13 at T1, a baseline, up to 18, 19. And we monitored those athletes for a period of around 2 years on this study.
So did you have any criteria who in terms of lifters would qualify for the study, who wouldn't, or you had everyone join, whoever was registered with Weightlifting Wales, or how did you go about selecting?
Yep. So we worked very closely with the 6 performance academies across Wales, and so it was pretty much just an election process whereby the academy coach would select a subgroup of athletes, of lifters that were primarily easy to access and constantly training in the environment. And so we could gain access to them pretty much on a weekly basis to monitor their progression. And so it was more of a selection based on availability rather than specific performance metrics.
Awesome. Okay, how many athletes did you end up having?
So we actually monitored across the 2-year period. We were able to monitor 29 athletes. We at baseline we did capture a few more than that. I think we captured around 50. But to follow, of course, the attrition rate meant that we had to essentially cut the sample size down to 29 across the 2-year period.
And could we ask why some of them dropped out?
Through a combination of factors, mainly due to drop out of the sport, but then also other factors such as availability on follow-up testing. And so because the geographical locations of the academies were such that we had to plan ahead for testing dates to factor in things like travel, budgeting and so on, not all athletes could attend the follow-up sessions, which I guess was a logistical limitation of this study, if you like, because profiling athletes on 650 data points roughly meant that you're either going to lose out on some data points or you're going to lose out on the observations, the athletes. So, but I think that 30 across the 2-year period is still quite a substantial amount, given the effort involved.
Okay, so what have you done?
Essentially, we developed a framework initially that tied in factors in high performance development into I call it a battery of tests, but essentially it's an informed data capture, which tied in, again, this holistic profile of athlete development, which includes subject areas such as demographics and family sporting history. So what sports did mom or dad play? Were there any siblings? Were they also involved in sport? The number of the places you've lived, home place throughout development, so the town size, birthplace effects, relative age in the calendar year. So these are all factors that, again, the literature does suggest contributes in one way or another towards high performance development. That also tied in with sport participation history and specific developmental milestones. So were there any donor sports potentially in the athlete's development? So did they come in from other sports? Did they perhaps sample gymnastics, athletics, rugby from an earlier age, and maybe that increased their exposure to Olympic weightlifting movements, as well as specific pathway milestones? So when they did enter the pathway, what were the specific performance criteria, or maybe they had to compete in specific competitions at different ages? And so all of these data points we captured throughout this 2-year period. And then lastly, we also captured specific practice activities that some of the athletes were exposed to. So these included approaches and motivation to practice. So how much proportion of practice involved deliberate practice versus deliberate play, how that changed throughout the ages and stages in the pathway.
Could you explain what deliberate play and deliberate practice are?
Yes, so early accounts of understanding expertise in the literature suggests that practice is important for development of high performance. And this literature was mainly observed in performance musicians, high performing musicians. And Erickson, back in 1993, essentially found that he could find a linear relationship between the amount of practice that was completed based on performance level. So those that were in the highest level for in their field actually accumulated much more deliberate practice than those that were perhaps at lower intermediate levels. And so the development of sports performance literature has also extended this to suggest that actually it's not just about deliberate practice, which again it was characterized initially as being very highly focused on the development of one's own performance. So through these accumulation of hours of practice, you tended to be very focused on areas in which you can improve your performance. And this wasn't necessarily an enjoyable element in the development of one's own performance. So since then, we've now come to understand that there are elements of practice that isn't necessarily deemed as being this highly focused, not inherently enjoyable element of performance or development of one's own performance. And we term this deliberate play, in which you're exposed to practice conditions, but there's an enjoyment aspect. You're not necessarily focused on your development, your own performance, but it's more so participation to enjoy, and development comes as secondarily to that, which also is shown to then support, once one does transition into higher degrees of deliberate practice, adherence to those sort of difficult moments in deliberate practice. If you've accumulated a higher degree of play, you can transition easier through the pathway when it does become time to become dedicated and focused on development of performance.
So the difference between play and practice would be that play, the main goal of play is having fun, and learning the skill of weightlifting would be the secondary goal. And in practice, the play element is a little bit sacrificed to enhance the learning of the skill.
Exactly that.
Okay. Yeah. We went through the areas where you were looking for variables. Did we cover all of them?
So there were a few more in terms of microstructure of practice. some of which were based on the athlete's approach themselves, so including deliberate practice, deliberate play, sort of non-physical practice of watching through learning, vicarious experiences, we call that. But then there was also some aspects of coaching involved in that microstructural practice. So how much of your coaching, how much feedback you receive vocally versus via a demonstration or via a video. Also factors that considered the transition in terms of the amount of the proportions of feedback that you were exposed to at different time points in the study. And in fact, some of the factors that came out around feedback from coach come up as predictive of success. And then there were also factors around constraints versus prescriptive coaching. And so how much of your practice throughout this observation period is constraints based versus prescriptive. Your coach telling you how to arrive at a solution versus the coach that could maybe set an environment up to allow you to arrive at your own solution through guided discovery. So we considered a whole range of factors in this particular study that potentially could contribute to the success of these lifters.
Okay, and I have one more question about feedback. How did you measure how feedback was given? And the same question would go for the coaching methods.
So we predominantly used survey stroke semi-structured interviews. So for any athlete that was not able to attend face-to-face interviews, we also conducted surveys. But in essence, we asked them to estimate the proportion of time we first of all gave them a definition of each of the feedback at a stroke and coaching aspects, and then asked them to sort of give a rough estimate of how much of their overall practice is represented in terms of proportions. And so for constraints-based versus prescriptive-based coaching, for example, we asked them to list at baseline the amount of practice that would be constraints-based versus prescriptive-based. Something like 80-20 would be a typical response, or 60-40. Similarly, for the amount of video versus instruction versus demo they received, typically it would be maybe a 33-33-33 split, or depending on the athlete's experience and development. Sometimes it could be more video, less video, and so on. So it's mainly in proportions in terms of percentages that we asked and measured throughout this observation period.
And how often did you do the interviews?
So we did a baseline. We captured the composition of practice at baseline, and then we also did it at T1, which was after 10 months, and then at T2, which was then 10 months on from that.
So 3 data point collections at 0. So when you started the study, 10 months, and then 22 months at the end of the study. Okay, anything about the procedures you would like to add?
There's a lot to pack in, and so there naturally is, collecting so much data points, Alex, means that I'm going to miss some aspects, but I think we covered a lot of ground and a lot of bases theoretically in profiling these athletes. We covered the psychosocial aspects. We also, and I forgot to mention that, we also collected psychosocial metrics, which included approach to mastery and performance, harmonious passion versus obsessive passion. These can all be found in the manuscript, the study paper itself. And so we covered a whole range of aspects across these 5 developmental themes.
Awesome. So did you travel to the athletes, or they had to come to you?
So we mainly had to travel. It involved a lot of travel, both in the north and south of Wales. If you know Wales at all, you know that the north and south is separated by quite beautiful mountains. So within each testing session, it involved travel between those mountains. I think I know them quite well, it's fair to say. So we would set the testing sites up at the academies and essentially run the testing days spread out through a testing window of say 1 month at each time.
Intensive.
Yeah.
So did you do any physical testing?
Yes, we also included a battery of physiology and metrics, which involve collecting information on body composition, body segment ratios, skeletal muscle strength, which included grip strength and asymmetries between grip strengths, back squat to body weight ratio, as well as front squat to body weight ratio. And then we also calculated some additional diagnostic parameters, which included from the counter movement jump, stretch shortening cycle utilization, as well as mobility and trunk stability in the overhead squat. So we considered both body composition and then metrics right the way through to dynamic strength, as well as mobility. Okay, we came out with the results.
Yes. So 650 down to how many and what are they?
And so what we ended up with was a model of approximately 9 characteristics. So 9 features out of the 685 data points that best separated high-performing from low-performing weightlifting athletes in the sample. So those 9 features spanned 4 of our developmental themes, 4 out of 5 of our developmental themes, namely demographics, psychosocial characteristics, sport participation histories, as well as specific practice features around specific practice activities. And so within demographics and family, the school being the main place for sport participation came out of separating performance groups very well, as well as psychosocial characteristic, namely perfectionism, specifically doubts about actions. So if you had more doubts about actions, you tended to be in the lower performing cohort. Sport participation history and weightlifting specific involvement tended to center around the exposure to flexibility and mobility training, both at age 11 and at age 14. So if you were exposed to more flexibility or mobility training at each of those ages, you were higher performing. You tended to be higher performing later on in the study.
Sorry, with the flexibility and mobility, did you have a cutoff point in terms of how much flexibility training they had to do?
Yes, so we looked at that in the odds ratio calculations. And so what the machine learning model does is it just determines the kind of the average score and looked at positive or negative weighting of that particular attribute. So it was either, in this case, at this stage, we're suggesting more or less is important for either high or low performance. We'll get into the specifics, I guess, of those in odds ratio, in the odds ratio calculations. And so there was, in that machine learning model, there was the amount of information received via a demonstration, proportion of extrinsic feedback, as well as the volume of flexibility and mobility practice, as well as some specific exposure to snatch and clean and jerk, snatch hold practice versus being higher in the high performance group and then the low performance group, which again speaks to the deliberate practice. More exposure to practice on specific lifts tends to be higher performing, a characteristic of higher performing athletes, as well as, interestingly, the last point being the change in the proportion of information received as video feedback between T1 and T2. So that was our only characteristic in the model that actually had a longitudinal character element to it, suggesting that as athletes transitioned between time points, if they were exposed to more video feedback, suggesting perhaps they were more comfortable with video feedback, maybe they were able to pick apart different things in video feedback that they otherwise wouldn't have done at baseline, they tended to be higher performing. And so that, again, was a longitudinal data point which suggested some specific implications around when to expose lifters to different forms of feedback.
Interesting.
So there's lots to unpack in that one model that captures a whole range of aspects in the holistic profile.
So were some of them more important than the others?
In essence, yes. When you look within the model itself, we reported the importance level, and so we determined importance level by the amount of algorithms that suggested a given factor was important. Now, what I mean by that is we use 4 different machine learning algorithms to essentially reduce the data set from 685 to 9. And we also were interested in how many of those 4 machine learning algorithms each factor appeared in. And if it's almost synonymous to asking 4 different experts which different factors are most important. That's how we thought of it. And so if all 4 experts agreed that a specific feature separated the groups, then we determined that feature as being very important. And so our criteria was based on whether, for a very important, fairly important, and important, was based on whether the factors appeared in 4, 3, or 2 of the machine learning algorithms, the feature selection algorithms. And so the very important factors that came out were exposure to sport participation at school, flexibility and mobility training at 14, being the most important, the fairly important factors being perfectionism and doubts about actions, as well as the volume of snatch practice by T1, as well as the changes in proportion of video feedback between T1 and T2. And then lastly, the important factors that appeared in 2 of the machine learning algorithms were flexibility and mobility training at age 11, proportion of extrinsic practice by T1, as well as the volume of flexibility and mobility training by T1. So there's again a range of different features that all of which, I guess, in the overarching picture are important, but we can look at can also look at, the relative importance within those as well.
Awesome. So we had machine learning. You define 9 aspects that were important. Now, how did you go about having the odds ratios? So odds ratios will be separating if this, how likely the athlete is to be performing well in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the thinking behind this was the machine learning approach tended to be quite reductionist in the sense that we're reducing a data set of 600 data points, all of which have their own theoretical relevance, down to maybe 8 or 9, which could potentially lead to something called overfitting the data. So over describing just this subsample which isn't necessarily best for generalizability beyond the sample of interest. And so what odds ratios enable you to do is they enable you to tie in some other factors in this framework that you developed that suggest maybe some more consideration outside of the machine learning model. And so what we found with odds ratios essentially was a few more additional characteristics from each of the developmental themes, as well as that many of which already appeared in the model that I previously discussed, but others had some enabled us to consider some other aspects within each of those developmental themes, which again helps to bolster out the narrative. And so specifically within demographics and family sport participation histories, we, as well as schooling, as I've mentioned, we also found within the odds ratio that the population of the longest residing home place between the age of 6 and 12 years, so having a home place of a population that has a population above 11,000 roughly, within Wales, that would be approximately a small to medium town size. So anything above that threshold tended to suggest that was more beneficial for higher performing individuals. In the manuscript, I discuss potential implications around infrastructure, town infrastructure, and how that can influence affordances for sport participation. So if you were exposed to more affordances for sport participation, that would tend to suggest that you participated in more sports between the ages 6 and 12. And as we suggested, that the implications around play to later support transition through the pathway is sort of implicit within that.
Bigger hometown, better.
Yes. And so typically across Wales, town sizes of medium and above tended to have more public facilities such as CrossFit gyms and weightlifting clubs that again enabled many of these athletes to be exposed to weightlifting to begin with, if not weightlifting, some other sport that had a positive transfer effect. And so home place definitely came out as an important, home place early in development came out as more important. Then we move on to some of the physiological parameters, and there were a few that came out as important as you would expect. Weightlifting is by nature quite reliant on physical attributes, and so the most predictive of these features that came out were the front squat to body mass ratio being above the norm for age and body weight, as well as the back squat to body mass ratio. So these are features that again are implicit within the training programs of many of the athletes. And so you could monitor really the progress in those 2 data points alongside their training. So there was no need for any additional testing.
With the ratios, you said above the norm. What was the norm? So
we used linear models to essentially normalize each athlete's scores based on an expected value. And so because we had a wide-ranging sample based on age and body weight, we had to normalize their performances somehow. And so we used linear regression models, which plotted age and body weight against their front or back squat to body mass ratio in this case, and determined whether or not they were above the regression line or below the regression line. So if P were above the regression line, you tended to be above the expected value. And that was the criteria in this case for that specific metric. In addition, I think another factor that's worth discussion in the anthropometrics and physiology was the mobility and trunk stability score, in which so the protocol for that was we essentially had athletes perform an overhead squat, and perpendicular to that overhead squat, we essentially recorded their limb angles. That included the torso, it included the shank, and included the thigh. And the most predictive angle in this case was the torso. And so we found that having a torso above the 65-degree mark meant you were much more of an upright, stable position in terms of the snatch. And so that came out as a factor as being highly predictive of performance 2 years later.
Wow.
Yeah, it's when you consider the whole holistic picture, if you tie in the fact that as well as the torso angle, they needed to have a back squat and front squat above the norm. As well as that, they needed to have been exposed to more sports throughout early in their development. As well as that, they needed to have exposure to sport at school. We're starting to build a really nice narrative here in terms of how to develop high performance and understand the development of high performance.
Will you be talking about deliberate practice and play?
Yes, I can do. So as we progress through, and many of these features are on the manuscript, so you can, the attributes that come out as important are separated by themes. So if you can explore them individually within your area of interest, if you like. So if you're more interested in some of the physiological aspects, the manuscript will of course cover a whole range of those physiological aspects. But let's move on to practice. And so within the odds ratio analysis, what we found was by looking at the exposure to different practice types across different ages, we can gauge an idea of when a significant jump in practice volumes tended to occur. And so by looking specifically in table 7 in the manuscript, what we found was that by exploring specific ages, we could see that from age 10, from age 11, age 12, being exposed to roughly 1 hour a week of flexibility and mobility training tended to be more beneficial for high performance. But interestingly, from age 14, that number tended to jump from 1 hour to 1 hour and a half, 2 hours from age 14 onwards. So that there has to be some form of increase in investment in practice volume, specifically in flexibility and mobility training at age 14. A similar story can be said of strength and conditioning training. At age 15, the recommended parameter jumped from 50 minutes to 2 hours and 15 minutes at age 15. And so that suggested that from age 15 onwards, there has to be that significant increase in jump in terms of practice volume. Similar story with the weightlifting, the technical elements of practice as well. So from age 15 onwards, 9.5 hours a week of weightlifting specific technical practice tended to occur in high performing individuals. But how that maybe shifted so that gives you an idea of practice volumes and the volume of practice that you ought to have been exposed to. But how perhaps is that represented in volumes of deliberate practice and deliberate play? We also explore in the study. So what we found was that it's not actually in the manuscript, but it is in let's just bear with me, it's in my PhD manuscript.
Yes.
So let's just bring that up.
Some backdoor data.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's just bear with me a second.
No problem.
Deliberate. So what we found was that in the T1, in terms of deliberate play and deliberate practice, we found that there was a 40% emphasis on deliberate play versus the practice. So 40% of practice tended to be playful activities, but by T2, that shifted to 5%, 95%. So 95% of practice was deliberate practice and less emphasis on play. And so what that suggested was there is a shift away from playful activities early in development to more of an element of focus on the development of one's own performance. That's probably suggested to also coincide with exposure to specific competitions. And so I guess the athletes themselves aren't necessarily told to move away from playful activities, but by being exposed to specific competitions, that almost encourages them to then develop their performance for the next upcoming competition. And so, whilst deliberate play, a transition away from deliberate play is important, how we go about navigating that probably happens through exposure to specific competitions.
That's interesting. So the high-level athletes would transition from 40% deliberate play to 5% deliberate play to increase the amount of practice.
Yeah, exactly that. The emphasis on the development of their own performance.
So how you think in terms of ages? Are there specific ages or years of experience? When would be the time to... So
I from the data, and as I mentioned...
I know that I'm asking you to kind of...
Yeah, of course. So again, what we're doing here is we're creating, from these data points, we're creating a narrative that, again, in many instances, you have to connect the dots. You have to have the theoretical background in order to be able to connect the dots. So what I'm suggesting from this is that when you consider that increase in practice volume happened between 14 and 15 years, and that was in flexibility, mobility training, strength and conditioning, as well as technical practice, I would suggest it would imply that perhaps the emphasis away from play into practice would also typically happen at that age and stage. So 14 to 15. That also marks the jump from youth, I think, into junior. So you're now competing at a different age group at 15 years old as well. And so considering those two factors, I think 14 15 tended to be the shift. It's difficult to say specifically based on the evidence, because we had such a wide age range. And so monitoring, we didn't necessarily control for age at baseline.
Yeah, then you would have to have, again, bigger sample, which is very costly. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly that. But and that, I mean, the literature also does suggest that investment into sport tends to happen between 13 and 15 years of age. So the developmental model of sports participation by Cote and colleagues suggested that actually the transition into specialization tended to happen at 13 anyway. So it kind of coincides with existing models of talent development.
So saying specialization, do you mean specifically weightlifting, or do you mean just athlete, a person dedicating themselves to sports? So they decide, I will be an athlete, I will invest my time into that, and as opposed to investing into arts or academics or...
Exactly that. Exactly both.
Okay.
You tend to you tend to specialize by saying you're investing into sports. That tends to be into a single sport, right? So you transition away from sport sampling, which happens between 6 and 12 years, into a specific sport by 13 and 15. And that tends to coincide with your identity as a person. You tend to tell others at that age that you are a weightlifting athlete, whereas before perhaps you didn't quite have that sense of identity. That's also fostered, as mentioned, by family values in sport. And so by often having a parent involved in sport or a sibling involved in sport, that tends to foster that identity as you transition into those specialization years.
Excellent. Other aspects, anything? Oh yeah, you mentioned volume of snatch as a whole. How it came up with odds ratios?
Yeah, so interestingly, the volume of practice in the snatch as a whole versus part practice in the literature is the degree to which it characterizes the degree to which you make a complex skill simpler. And so in many instances, such as a golf swing, you would need to break down a skill into parts before combining those parts to a whole movement. What the data suggests is that in the snatch, you actually need to, at some stage, I think it was, the odds ratio suggested 15. By 15, those movements needed to have been well organized so that you increase the amount of practice volume that you complete in the snatch by 15. So again, that needs to be quite a strong emphasis of practicing the snatch as a whole movement from the first phase right the way to the catch, mainly because the complexity of the movement is such that a degree of high organization needs to happen at the motor level in order for you to be able to add load and increase your performance. And that wasn't represented in the clean and jerk in the same way. So the clean and jerk, in essence, there was more emphasis on part practice, specifically because the clean and jerk is, in essence, separate lifts in itself. And so there needed to be some emphasis on the clean as well as some emphasis on the jerk separately. And so we had a difference in the relationship between whole and part practice in the snatch versus the clean and jerk.
So did you have proportion of training?
So let's see. Again, we didn't report that in the manuscript. So let's see if we have it in. There's so many data points in findings that we had to cut down quite a lot in order to publish. So let's see, at T1, the proportion of part practice for the clean and jerk in all 23 low performing athletes was at least 50% of practice. At T2, part practice in the clean and jerk tended to be at least 70%. So part practice actually increased in the clean and jerk throughout this particular study. So 70% of the lower performing cohort, 70% of practice tended to occur more so in the lower performing cohort, suggesting that there is an emphasis on practice of the clean and jerk being a whole movement in higher performing athletes. So actually the lower performing cohort tended to break down the clean and jerk into sub movements or parts, whereas this wasn't the case in the higher performing cohort. So the higher performing cohort tended to practice the clean and jerk as a whole movement, and more so than the lower performing. So that was in the clean and jerk. In the snatch, okay, so we pick apart the most important findings. So we don't, if it didn't come out as a predictive factor in terms of the percentages. We didn't actually report the specific percentages because they hadn't come out as predictive in the manuscript. So there was, in other words, there was no differences in the percentages in predicting high performance. What we had found though in the snatch was that there was a higher accumulation of volume for the snatch in higher performing individuals of whole practice so a higher accumulation of whole practice in the snatch for higher performing individuals by T2. Yeah. So specifically by T2, higher performing athletes had accumulated at least 313 hours snatch part practice and at least 327 hours of snatch whole practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so roughly, I guess, 50-50 proportion split, maybe a little bit more emphasis in the whole practice for the higher performing individuals. Whereas this wasn't the case there was only one in 23 of the low performing athletes that had accumulated this volume practice. So suggesting that overall the volumes in both needed to be higher, but there was no emphasis of the snatch in terms of proportions. That's hence why we hadn't reported.
Okay, so following up on this question, do you think that part of the difference was how much the high performance group was practicing in general? More flexibility training, more strength and conditioning, more skill training, more whole movement practice?
Yes. In short, the data suggests that higher volumes of practice tended to be best predictive of performance, more so than the proportion splits. When it comes to proportion splits, the most predictive proportion split that came out was the proportion of feedback, as I mentioned before. So there was more of an emphasis on video feedback as the athletes transitioned, rather than the volume of feedback, if you like.
I would be interested to talk about it too. I have a question. I will ask it now, but you can decide to answer it later. So the question would be, you have monitored athletes for 2 years and then 12 months to see how they performed in weightlifting. Do you think it's possible that if you would follow up the athletes 5 or 10 years, the split between high and low performance could be different? So in other words, could low performing athletes become high performing athletes? Yeah, the other way.
Yes. No, absolutely. Interesting. Perfect question, Alex. In the sense that there are clear limitations to the study design in terms of the time of the observation window that we allowed for. Generally speaking, when analyzing historical data, that the past 20 years of historical competition records, transition from a lower performing to a high performing tended to not to happen after a given age window. So after junior, so from the age of 17 onwards, that tended not to occur. If you were in the pathway from that early age, you can of course join the pathway later on and transition from high performing based on experience level. So if you came in as a 17-year-old with very little experience, there was the tendency to move from lower performing to higher performing. But if you were in the pathway from early and showed that actually your performance was sub elite from that early age, then transition to later on become higher performing was harder, or tended not to happen. So I guess at competitive experience level, or the amount of years involved, which we didn't necessarily control for in this study. And so maybe we could have observed that some of the lower performing sample, if they had a relatively lower amount of competitive experience or time involved in weightlifting, then the chances of them then transitioning a few more years down the line would have been higher. But again, unlikely to happen, but it's possible depending on the volumes of practice accumulated.
So
observation point. Talent development, I think, should not be. I think we've moved on from the narrative of talent development being just a simple eye test or a one-off competition performance to say, yes, that's the new future Olympic champion. Unfortunately, we need to begin to adopt more prospective, longitudinal methodologies where we look at the progression of the athlete over an extended period of time rather than very small specific windows.
Could you speak a little bit about the feedback and how it influenced or was related to performance?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, the proportion of video feedback that was received from a type of feedback rather that was received from coaches to the athletes tended to change throughout the study. And so what we found was that high performing individuals actually began to shift into more forms of video feedback as the study progressed. Now that's, I guess there's a number of implications that could be drawn from that. Perhaps athletes became more experienced as they transitioned through the study, and so they were more comfortable with video feedback and extracting specific elements of performance from video than they wouldn't have been able to do right at the beginning of the study. And so that there's a natural transition into video. Or it could be coaching method, it could be coaching mechanism. Maybe some coaches, which we didn't explore in the study, some coaches may have not enabled the athletes to be exposed to more video. That's something that requires further discussion and investigation. But nonetheless, that transition into receiving more video information tended to be predictive of high performance. Also, many of the athletes had coaches that were over longer distances, and so if they change coach or they've relocated, they tended to keep the same. They tended to be exposed to more video forms of feedback anyway. So that, again, it requires further investigation, but it does suggest that there should be an emphasis on video feedback the more experienced the athletes become.
It could be also related to the transition from play, where it doesn't really matter how it looks, to the practice where it really matters how it looks. So
absolutely. Yep, absolutely. I think there was also an emphasis on intrinsic or self-generated feedback versus externally generated feedback. I think we also found that at T1, 5 out of 6 of the high-performing athletes reported that there was at least 20% of their feedback coming from their own self-generated, whilst this was only happening in 2 of the 23 lower-performing athletes. So 5 out of the 6 high-performing athletes were able to generate their own forms of feedback at T1, and the remaining 80% tended to come from their coach. And this was not found in the lower performing athletes. So perhaps they were more dependent on coach generated or external generated forms of feedback. Yeah, and at T2 that shifted to 25%. So it's a very little shift in the proportions there. But again, it does suggest that an element of feedback ought to come from the athletes themselves. However, that doesn't discard the fact that, especially in weightlifting, having that external eye, having that external form of feedback via a coach or video should be the large majority of talent development, training or feedback in developing athletes.
We didn't talk too much about it, and I'm super curious for you to explain mastery approach.
Achievement motivation, in essence, describes your motivation for achievement of competence in 2 different aspects. Task mastery, which essentially is outperforming yourself or bettering yourself and your own performances, versus performance-based approach, which essentially compares yourself to a normative standard or others. And so those dual elements of motivation can often characterize how we engage in a task. And so the approach and avoidance mechanism comes in when we are either characterized as approaching competence or outperforming yourself. Generally, you either approach competence, or you're motivated by outperforming yourself or outperforming others, or you engage in a task to avoid being incompetent. Very similar, but also very different. And so in a group dynamic setting, you could either approach being the best in the group, if that's a performance-based approach, or being the best version of yourself, or you can avoid being the worst in the group or being the worst version of yourself. And so you can imagine that being a very different approach to training, and that can actually influence how you then approach and engage weightlifting training. And so what we found was that the majority of the higher performing athletes tended to have this mastery approach. So they were motivated by achieving competence that was focused on the development of their own performance, whereas the reverse tended to be shown in the lower performing sample, whereby they were avoiding being worse than themselves. And so there was an emphasis on not doing it as badly as I did it the last time, whereas in the high performing, they were focused on outperforming what they did last time. So that's a slightly different mechanism there, but it also characterizes perhaps the attitudes towards training in some of the high performing individuals versus the lower performing. And this was also shown in the performance approach. So that was mastery approach and avoidance. But in the performance approach, higher performing athletes were also motivated by being better than others. And this wasn't as prevalent in the lower performing sample. So yeah, that's the achievement motivation. More emphasis on mastery approach, outperforming yourself and outperforming others versus avoiding being the worst. I think it's also worth discussing harmonious passion as well, just in the psychosocial profile, because that was the highest odds ratio score And in essence, harmonious passion describes an engagement in a passion of yours that is synonymous to your environment. So what that means in simple terms is you engage in something because you love it, you enjoy it, it's your passion, but also that passion that doesn't result in any form of conflict in your social network or your environment, or it's also synonymous with the values that surround you. Obsessive passion is actually the reverse of that. Obsessive passion is a passion that you enjoy doing, you want to do, but it actually can result in some form of conflict in your environment. And so I guess a few examples of that would be enjoying and listening to very loud music. That could be a very strong passion of yours, but it's not going to be conducive to your environment. You often may have problems, at home with family and so on. The same occurs with weightlifting. So higher performing athletes tended to have this passion for weightlifting, but it was supported within their immediate environment. It was harmonious with their immediate environment. So through social media, through their club, through their club environment, this passion tended to be fostered. That led to very little conflict, which I also think is quite key.
That's huge. And I expect that it also influences family support, possibly with the young.
Absolutely. There were many anecdotes whilst observing some of the athletes whereby parental support in terms of access to specific competitions. Some athletes may have had exams coming up, and so there became an immediate conflict between training and exams. You can imagine that being quite a prevalent thing in youth athletes. And so how is that handled? How is that supported by the immediate environment, by the support network of the athletes? Not saying that they should choose weightlifting over exams. I suppose the support mechanism would be slightly different for less harmonious passion individuals rather than the reverse.
We have to talk about competition.
So do you mean the preparation for competition?
Mm-hmm.
So these two features were features that also came out as predictive in the Great British Medalist Project.
Mm-hmm.
So two relative importance of sport was found to be a particular factor in super elite British medalists. And so we aimed a discriminative factor in super elite British medalists. So we aimed to repeat that measure and paradigm in this study. And we found that, yes, high performing athletes had a degree of relative importance of sport. So that was the perspective of sport relative to other life interests and responsibilities, such as career, studies, and other life choices, socializing, and so on. And so what we found was that the high performing athletes had a higher degree of relative importance of sport in their life. That coincides with obviously the investment and emphasis on deliberate practice, as we discussed, but also from a social aspect, they placed a higher degree of weightlifting in their overall identity. How we specifically measured that was we got them to place two circles side by side, and we had just asked them to overlap the circles. And higher performing athletes tended to, the two circles were weightlifting and myself as a construct, and the higher performing athletes actually overlap these circles much more so than the lower performing athletes. Lower performing athletes had a separate identity of weightlifting in themselves, more so than the lower performing. So that would be a suggestion that sport tended to be held in a higher degree of importance in the higher performing group. And then total preparation for competition, and this also coincided with some aspects in perfectionism in the high performing athletes. As you can see in table 6, organization tended to come out as a very predictive feature in higher performing athletes, as well as this aspect, total preparation for competition, which essentially, when you consider those two factors together, it suggests that the higher performing athletes often left no stone unturned in preparation for their competition, so that they felt, you would feel typically that there is not much more that can be done in terms of the preparation for competition. And this was more reflected in the higher performing group than the lower performing group. Lower performing group often felt as though they weren't as prepared for competition as they would have hoped.
If you would have to guess how much, because surely, as you described, the mental side is very important. The identity, the aligning your body, your life to be able to perform at the highest level. How much is that, and how much is the physical attributes, the front squat to body weight ratio, and the torso angle, and so on? Wow, what are the proportions, you think?
Yes, so an interesting follow-up analysis of this particular data set would be determining the weightings of each of those factors. The fact that in this case the back squat to body mass ratio didn't appear as prevalent in the model, the machine learning model, could suggest that it's not as relatively important as these other factors that came out, there could be the possibility that this is an overfit of the particular date of the particular sample. So I would speculate that the more data that you would feed this study, the more there would be an emphasis on some of the physical attributes in weightlifting, more so than in comparison to other sports. So whatever proportion the physiological aspects in weightlifting are, and I think I wrote an article, I published some analyses on LinkedIn that showed that there was approximately 50% and 70% respectively of performance in weightlifting could be accounted for by body weight and age, and competitive experience. So that leaves 45% and 30% to be accounted for by other factors. And of course, from this study, it suggests that those additional factors are somewhat what makes the additional difference above the 45 and above the 50% and 70% in men and women. So yes, there is going to be a lot of emphasis on physiological development in weightlifting athletes, but that physiological development has to happen as a result of some important antecedents. There has to be family values in sport. There has to be the emphasis on total preparation for competition. There has to be an emphasis on that passion for weightlifting has to be harmonious, and transition from play to practice, and all of these elements definitely do contribute. But the relative weightings, I'd really love to follow up in analysing this data set again, just to determine the relative percentages of each.
Yeah, that will be awesome. Do you think you will revisit the study, do the follow up?
Yeah, I think so. If I can find the time to, I think it's worth looking at again for sure. Because also with the odds ratios at the statistical level, we're considering each of these attributes in isolation. So the odds ratios themselves are considered independently of all of the odds ratio attribute, the logical conditions. So I would really like to combine some of these. So I would really like to look at how the odds ratio would change if we considered that athletes in the data had a front squat and a back squat, and they had maybe school main play for sport participation. What would the odds ratio be as a result of those three factors combined, and so on? And we can continue to build from there. That's probably a really good follow-up, looking at combinations of odds ratios.
Exciting time.
Yeah, it's we're in a really interesting time. This particular study does enable us to explore opportunities for athlete development that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And so we could take an athlete at 12 years old and we could prescribe what their practice would typically look like, what their motivational approaches to practice would typically look like, how those proportions will change throughout as they transition through the pathway. And so we can build a really nice holistic pathway for these athletes as they develop, to enable them to explore as many opportunities as possible that they otherwise wouldn't have considered.
Is that how the study is used now by Weightlifting Wales?
Yes. So weightlifting have taken many of the parameters and recommendations from this. From this study, we produced an executive summary report, which actually showcases the results in an infographic. In many cases, it reduces the findings to its most important aspects. We present this in the summary report, and now they have introduced recommendations for practice volumes at specific ages, exposure to different modalities of training as well, so flexibility as well as S&C. And so they're now beginning to incorporate these recommendations into their strategies for talent development.
Excellent.
It's really exciting.
Yeah, that's the best, when the research is applied and changing how the things are done. That's the best.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we can't predict the talent, but if you would like to monitor athletes or try to look for talent within a pool of athletes you are having, what aspects would you be measuring and how often? And the absolute minimum, of course, it is unrealistic to expect coaches to monitor 648 variables, but are there any, apart from volumes we mentioned already and these time points where the certain modalities should be introduced, anything the coaches could or should be measuring?
From the data suggests that absolutely we definitely don't need to begin profiling athletes on these whole ranges of data points, but the data does suggest that we ought to consider wider demographics and family influences in talent development. And so if you have two athletes, for instance, that have very similar physical parameters and are exposed to very similar training modalities, I think you then ought to consider some of the external factors that could contribute to their engagement and attitudes towards their training. An athlete who has a father or mother involved in weightlifting will have a very different dynamic in terms of home values than the athlete that doesn't. And so how can you support the two? And that shouldn't be a means for talent selection. It shouldn't be a means for talent identification, but it's how can you support the one that doesn't, so that they're exposed to. And there are ways that you could do this. You could, mentorships. Of course, coaching comes into this, but it's how can you foster those values of sport where in instances that they wouldn't be as exposed to them in their home or family environment. And that's the same for home place as well, town infrastructure and things like that. So we just want to ensure that we level the playing field where possible, using these findings.
Yeah, that's interesting. Important aspect there, the support that is required to some extent, because if it's a clear differentiating factor between high performing and low performing, this is something that will possibly cut off some athletes from the sport. So
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, taken seriously.
Yeah, we know that training volumes are important. We know that should be at the forefront, but it's who's going to achieve those training volumes and why is it that they're going to achieve those training volumes? Those are areas of consideration.
Yes, they're the intangibles.
Yeah,
so we can't touch, but are obvious, at least from the study. So
yeah, absolutely. They're there, and they show that they're repeated in many instances in the literature as well. So it just goes to show that these are factors that ought to be considered. I hope the viewers have enjoyed delving into the study. They can, of course, contact me through social media, Twitter and LinkedIn, and let's continue the discussion.
Awesome. Would you like to mention your handle on Twitter so it's easy for everyone to find?
Yep, of course. So it's Dior Anderson on LinkedIn and Twitter. And of course, I'm continuing this area of research and building out some systems and technologies that can help to streamline and capture some of these holistic profiles. And so if you're interested in conducting similar investigations, then of course reach out. Be interested to open discussion.
Do you want to mention the name of the company so people can Google and kind of?
Yes. So it's Talent Pathway ID. So that's the startup that we founded sort of post PhD. So that's my post PhD life, in which we are building award-winning sports technology. We won the Sports Technology Award back in 2022 for the best coaching and performance technology. And so it's quite an exciting time, and very excited to continue this work in understanding and developing talent.
Is it across the sports or?
Yes, so we have a few ongoing data capture systems. So we're working with many esports organizations. So from the pro level right the way through to the grassroots, in which we simply have players periodically complete some profiling using a very similar but not the same methodology. In profiling their development, of course, it's going to be very specific to the sport, in which we aim to understand their development and then support them on their journey. So Talent Pathway is enabling them to understand their development and tying in their support networks such as their coach and so on. So we have work with them, and we also have work ongoing with National Governing Body for Canoe in Wales, and we also are continuing some work not directly related to this, but a separate project with Weightlifting Wales, whereby we're supporting their member perspectives on their program, the national programs that they're undergoing using data-driven insights. So yeah, we're expanding the code base and expanding the use cases across various sports. So we're excited to keep growing.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Last question: what is your favorite color?
Good question. It's always been blue, so I'm going to stick with it. Always been blue. M&M's, the M&M's blue, the sort of royal blue. That's
okay.
My color of interest. I have no idea why. Is there any connection? Is there any background as to?
I think blue. Yeah, I will tell you the background. But first, the comment: the blue is pretty popular with researchers. Yeah, it is
interesting.
Vicky mentioned blue. She was more into sea blue.
Oh, okay, nice.
So maybe we should run some analysis.
Reflective, critical thinking.
Maybe.
I guess. Yeah.
So I'm asking because for every study, I invite an author from. I make an infographic, and I use the colors the researchers like, so they can have the infographic that is relevant to them too.
Amazing.
The least I can do.
Yes, absolutely. Love it, Alex. Brilliant.
Okay, dear. Thank you so much for today.